Here's something I keep coming back to. Every single company in this video saw it coming. Not vaguely, not kind of. They had internal memos, they had market research. They had engineers who stood up in meetings and said, in plain language, this is what's going to happen to us if we don't change. And in every single case, the people at the top of these companies made a choice, not a mistake, a deliberate, documented, defensible choice, to protect what they already had instead of building what was coming next. Blockbuster, BlackBerry, Netscape, AOL, Vine, Sony, 6 companies, 6 industries, 6 completely different decades, and the exact same decision, made by different people in different rooms, leading to the exact same outcome. I've been thinking about these stories for a long time, and the longer I sit with them, the more I notice something uncomfortable. Every one of these companies, when they made the decision that destroyed them, was being run by intelligent people with real data. They weren't ignoring the future because they were arrogant or lazy. They were ignoring it because every incentive structure around them pointed in the other direction. That's the part that's hard to talk about. Because if the smartest people in the room, with all the resources in the world, made this same mistake over and over, what does that say about the mistake itself? I think it says the mistake isn't really about intelligence. It's about something older and more stubborn than intelligence. It's about the difference between what an organization is built to protect and what the moment actually requires. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with a late fee. In 1985, a man named David Cook opened a video rental store in Dallas, Texas. He had a simple idea. At the time, most video rental stores were small, locally owned, and carried a few hundred titles. Cook wanted to build something different, a superstore model for video, the same way that Walmart had built a superstore model for general retail. The first Blockbuster was 8,000 square feet. It had 6,000 titles on the shelves, more than any rental store in the country. Computerized checkout, extended hours, well-lit, organized, easy to navigate. It was, by the standards of 1985 video rental, extraordinary. Within a year, Cook had 19 stores. Within 3 years, he had attracted the attention of a man named H. Wayne Huizenga. Huizenga is not a famous name today, but he should be. He had already built waste management from a single garbage truck into the largest waste management company in America. He had built AutoNation into the largest car dealership chain in the country. He understood better than almost anyone alive at that point what it meant to take a local, fragmented industry and build a national chain at scale. He looked at the video rental business and saw the same opportunity he had seen in garbage collection and car dealerships. He bought Blockbuster from Cook in 1987 for $60 million. What followed was one of the most aggressive retail expansions in American history. By 1994, over 3,500 Blockbuster stores. By 1999, 9,000. In some years, Blockbuster was opening a new location somewhere in the world every 17 hours. 84,000 employees, $6 billion in annual revenue. At its peak, Blockbuster had 47 million registered members in the United States alone, almost a fifth of the American population. But here's the thing nobody tells you when they tell the Blockbuster story. The movies were almost incidental to the business model. What Blockbuster was actually selling, the product that generated almost a sixth of its total revenue, was the late fee. If you kept a tape or DVD past its due date, Blockbuster charged you per day. Those fees generated approximately $800 million a year at peak, close to $1 billion annually, coming from people who forgot to return their rentals on time. This matters for understanding what happened next. Because the late fee wasn't just a revenue line, it was a cultural fact, the thing that millions of Americans associated with Blockbuster above everything else. Not the selection, not the convenience, the late fee, the punishment, the petty tax on forgetting. It was the thing people hated most about the experience. In 1997, a software engineer in California named Reed Hastings drove to his local Blockbuster to return Apollo 13. He had kept it too long. The late fee was $40. He paid it. And on the drive home, he couldn't stop thinking about it. $40 for a movie he had already watched and returned. He had a gym membership. He paid monthly. He could go as many times as he wanted. Nobody charged him a late fee for not showing up on Tuesday. Why couldn't video rental work the same way? The next week, he co-founded Netflix. Now, here's where the common version of this story goes wrong, because the common version leaves out the most interesting part. Most people believe Netflix invented streaming. Streaming killed Blockbuster, and that's the whole story. That's not what happened. Not even close. Netflix spent its first 7 years mailing DVDs in red envelopes. That's it. No streaming, no recommendation algorithm, no original content, just DVDs in the mail with a monthly subscription fee, no due dates, and, crucially, no late fees. The irony is almost too perfect. Netflix's entire founding proposition was the elimination of the thing that was generating almost $1 billion a year for Blockbuster. In 2000, Reed Hastings flew to Dallas. He walked into Blockbuster's corporate headquarters and sat across from the CEO, a man named John Antioco, and he made a proposal. Buy us, $50 million for the entire company. You take the Netflix brand, the subscriber base, the technology, the team. We'll run the online division. You keep the stores. You make it work together. Antioco reportedly laughed at him. $50 million for a DVD by mail startup with fewer than 1 million subscribers, that was still losing money? He passed. Hastings flew home. For a few years, the decision looked correct. Netflix was small. Blockbuster was enormous. The metrics pointed in Blockbuster's direction. Then 2004 happened. Blockbuster launched Blockbuster Online. And here's the part that never makes it into the Netflix documentary. Blockbuster Online was by almost every measurable metric better than Netflix. More titles, faster delivery in most markets, no late fees. Antioco had finally eliminated them. And one feature Netflix couldn't touch: total access. With total access, you could return your online rentals at any physical Blockbuster store and pick up a free in-store rental in exchange. You got the convenience of online plus the immediacy of the physical store. By 2006, Netflix was losing subscribers to Blockbuster. Antioco had spent several $100 million on the online division, and it was working. The gap was closing. Then Carl Icahn got involved. Icahn was an activist investor who had taken a significant stake in Blockbuster. He viewed the online spending as reckless. He thought Antioco was bleeding the company to death, chasing a digital future that didn't need to be built. In 2005, Antioco's contract was not renewed. The new CEO, Jim Keyes, ran a full strategic review. His conclusion was that the online business was a distraction, that physical stores were the future, that Blockbuster's competitive advantage was its real estate and its relationships with studios. He brought back the late fees that Antioco had eliminated, the late fees that Reed Hastings had dedicated his entire company to destroying. They came back to Blockbuster stores in 2007. Subscribers began leaving immediately. In 2007, Netflix launched streaming. In 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy with nearly $1 billion in debt. At the exact moment Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, Netflix was worth approximately $3 billion. Today, it's worth $250 billion. John Antioco, the CEO, who had been trying to fix Blockbuster, who had built the online division, who had eliminated the late fees, later gave an interview where he said the Icahn intervention was the single event that changed the trajectory. He called it the moment Blockbuster's chance disappeared. There is one Blockbuster store left in the world. It's in Bend, Oregon, run by a woman named Sandy Harding, who has operated it as a community institution for decades. People drive hours to visit it. It has a 5-star rating on Yelp. It sells Blockbuster merchandise, hats, shirts, candles scented to smell like a video store. The last Blockbuster is now more famous than Blockbuster ever was. Before we talk about what went wrong with BlackBerry, let me tell you what BlackBerry actually was. Not the brand, not the device. What it actually meant to the people who used it. In 2009, RIM, Research in Motion, the company behind BlackBerry, had approximately 50% of the United States enterprise smartphone market. Not 20%, not 30%, 50%. 1 out of every 2 smartphones used by American corporations, law firms, government agencies, and banks was a BlackBerry. The device was genuinely addictive. Psychologists who studied mobile phone behavior in the mid-2000s coined a specific term for BlackBerry use: continuous partial attention. Users weren't checking their phones occasionally. They were monitoring them constantly, a background process running all the time like breathing. The press called it the crackberry. Barack Obama refused to give his up when he was elected president in 2008. His security team spent months trying to convince him that the standard BlackBerry posed an unacceptable intelligence risk. Obama refused to hand it over. Eventually, the NSA built him a custom hardened version of the device. He used it throughout his presidency. Mike Lazaridis and Doug Freegan had founded RIM in a small office in Waterloo, Ontario in 1984. Lazaridis was the technical genius, a University of Waterloo engineering student who had built electronic displays for local businesses before turning his attention to wireless communications. They started the company with $15,000 and a government grant. The first BlackBerry, the 850, launched in 1999. It was a pager, not a phone. A two-way pager that could receive and send emails wirelessly. In 1999, this was remarkable enough on its own. Within 5 years, it had evolved into the full device the world knew: physical keyboard, encrypted messaging, battery life measured in days, not hours. Direct integration with corporate email servers, the device that ran on time. By 2009, RIM had 50 million subscribers globally. Its market capitalization had peaked at over $80 billion. And then January 9th, 2007 happened. Steve Jobs walked onto the Macworld stage in San Francisco and held up a device that Apple had been building in secret for 2.5 years. A 4-inch touchscreen, no keyboard, full internet browser, multi-touch gestures, a phone, an iPod, and an internet device all in one. Inside RIM, in offices in Waterloo and around the world, engineers watched the live stream. What the engineers said to each other has been documented in multiple subsequent books and interviews. The predominant reaction among those who understood what they were looking at technically was something close to panic. They recognized what was in Jobs' hands. They understood the implications. What the leadership said was different. Mike Lazaridis, after watching the announcement, reportedly told colleagues that the iPhone could not do what it claimed to do, that the battery couldn't survive real-world use, that the network wasn't capable of supporting full web browsing at scale, that the touchscreen keyboard would never work for professional users who needed to type quickly without looking. He was wrong about almost all of it. But here's what you have to understand. Mike Lazaridis was not an idiot. He was one of the most technically accomplished engineers in the mobile industry. He had real reasons for every objection he raised. They were the right questions to ask. They led to the wrong conclusions. The problem was structural. BlackBerry's entire identity, its reason for existing, its competitive position, its pricing power, was built on a specific and fixed definition of what a smartphone was. A smartphone, by the BlackBerry definition, was a device for fast, secure, efficient professional communication. The physical keyboard wasn't a feature. It was the philosophy. The idea that a glass slab could replace it wasn't just technically inferior. It was conceptually wrong. Lazaridis couldn't step outside that frame. He had built the frame himself. The co-CEO model made it worse. RIM was run simultaneously by Lazaridis, the engineer, and Jim Balsillie, the business development executive. In a stable environment, the model worked. In a crisis, it was catastrophic. Decisions required both men to agree. Neither had full authority. Moves that should have taken weeks took months. BlackBerry's response to the iPhone, the Storm, launched in 2008. It was a touchscreen device. But Lazaridis couldn't bring himself to fully commit to glass. The Storm had a physical clicking mechanism under the display. The entire screen pressed down like a button when you typed. The concept was to give users the tactile feedback of a physical key even on a touchscreen. The execution was a disaster. The clicking mechanism was unreliable. The software was buggy. Reviews were savage. Early adopters returned units in large numbers. In 2011, RIM launched the Playbook tablet. It had no native email application. A BlackBerry tablet with no BlackBerry email. The response from enterprise customers was bewilderment. In 2013, Lazaridis and Balsillie both resigned. The new CEO launched BB10, a genuinely modern operating system, competitive on its own technical merits. The app gap was fatal. By 2013, iOS and Android had hundreds of thousands of applications each. BlackBerry's App Store had tens of thousands. Enterprise IT departments had already committed to managing iOS and Android. The switching cost was too high. BlackBerry's market share declined from 20% in 2009 to less than 1% by 2016. The company still exists. It pivoted to software, security products, enterprise mobility management. Its market capitalization is approximately $400 million. At its peak, it was worth $80 billion. The engineers who saw what was coming in January 2007 spent the next 9 years watching the company that employed them decline in a straight line. Several have been interviewed since. They described the period after the iPhone announcement as a specific kind of organizational paralysis. Not denial exactly, something more like knowing that something terrible is happening and not having the authority or the structure to do anything about it fast enough to matter. This next one is different from the others in a specific way. With Blockbuster and BlackBerry, the companies failed because of internal decisions. The market shifted, and they couldn't shift with it. With Netscape, a competitor made a deliberate decision to destroy them, not to outcompete them, to destroy them. Illegally, as the United States Department of Justice would later find. And they came very close to getting away with it. Let me take you back to 1993, to a computer lab at the University of Illinois. A 22-year-old student named Mark Andreessen is working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. He and a colleague named Eric Bina spend 3 months building something they call Mosaic. It's a browser, software that retrieves documents from web servers and displays them. But unlike anything before it, Mosaic displays images alongside text. It works on multiple operating systems. It's navigable with a mouse. It has a graphical interface anyone can learn in minutes. They released Mosaic for free in early 1993. Within 12 months, 2 million copies have been downloaded. Andreessen moves to Silicon Valley. He meets Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics. Clark says, "Let's build a company around this." They recruit the core Mosaic team, build an improved browser they call Netscape Navigator, and launch. In August 1995, Netscape goes public. The stock is priced at $28. On the first day of trading, it opens at $71 and closes at $58. In a single day, a company that had never turned a profit became worth over $2 billion. Mark Andreessen, 24 years old, is on the cover of Time magazine sitting barefoot in a throne. This is the moment historians point to as the beginning of the first internet boom. Within a year, Netscape Navigator had approximately 90% of the browser market, and Andreessen's vision extended far beyond the browser. He was building toward web applications, software that would run in the browser rather than installed on a computer. If this worked, the browser would become the platform. The operating system, specifically Windows, would become irrelevant. Bill Gates understood exactly what Andreessen was building. In May 1995, Gates wrote a memo to Microsoft's senior leadership. The subject line was, "The Internet Tidal Wave." In it, Gates explicitly identified the Internet as the single most important technological development since the IBM PC. He identified Netscape specifically as the threat that could make Windows obsolete. He called for the entire company to redirect around Internet competition. Microsoft had a browser of its own, Internet Explorer, built on technology licensed from a company that was itself based on Andreessen's original Mosaic code. Gates gave an explicit order: beat Netscape. What followed was a 4-year campaign that the United States Department of Justice would eventually find to be a violation of federal antitrust law. Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with Windows for free, not available as a download, not sold separately. Built into the operating system, set as the default browser, placed on the desktop, shipped on every computer that ran Windows. Netscape charged $49 for Navigator. You cannot compete with free when free comes pre-installed on every device your customer buys. The more serious violation was what Microsoft required of PC manufacturers. If a computer maker wanted to ship Windows, and they had to sign agreements restricting their ability to promote competitors' software. In many cases, they were contractually prohibited from making Netscape Navigator easy to access or set as the default browser. Microsoft was using its monopoly in operating systems to suppress its competitor in browsers. The DOJ filed suit in 1998. The trial lasted years. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, in his final ruling, found that Microsoft had engaged in monopolistic practices and ordered the company to be broken up into two separate entities. The breakup order was appealed and overturned. Microsoft paid essentially nothing. Its behavior changed almost nothing. But by then, Netscape was already gone. In November 1998, AOL had acquired Netscape for $4.2 billion. AOL treated it as a media property, not a technology asset. By 2003, AOL had discontinued active Netscape browser development. Navigator's market share, which had been 90% in 1996, fell below 1% by 2006. Here's the ending that matters. Before Netscape was shut down, a small group of engineers convinced AOL to release the browser's source code publicly. The project they created was called Mozilla. In November 2004, 7 years after Microsoft had begun its campaign, Firefox 1.0 was released. In its first year, Firefox was downloaded 100 million times. The browser that Microsoft had tried to bundle into irrelevance came back as open-source software that Microsoft could not buy, could not bundle against, and could not legally suppress. Marc Andreessen went on to co-found one of the most powerful venture capital firms in the world. His portfolio includes Facebook, Twitter, Airbnb, GitHub, Lyft, and dozens of others. He never stopped building. Internet Explorer is dead. Microsoft killed it permanently in 2022. Firefox is still here. On January 10, 2000, Steve Case and Gerald Levin stood together in front of cameras and announced what they called a merger of equals, AOL and Time Warner. $165 billion, the largest merger in American corporate history. One of the Time Warner executives, who was present for the internal announcement, later described what he saw. He said that when the deal was explained to the senior leadership of Time Warner, what the terms were, what they were exchanging their company for, several of his colleagues began to cry. He said they were not crying from joy. They were crying because they understood, in that moment, that they had just been purchased, not in a merger, but in an acquisition, by a company that was, in almost every concrete sense, smaller than them. And they understood that the currency being used to buy them was a stock supported primarily by the expectation that things would keep going up forever. AOL, America Online, was the internet for most American households. Not because it was technically superior. The service ran on proprietary software. The dial-up connections were slower than alternatives. But AOL had done something brilliant. Starting in the early 1990s, it had mailed free trial CDs to virtually every household in America. Multiple times. Some estimates suggest AOL mailed 3 billion CDs over the course of the 1990s. The discs came in the mail, fell out of magazines, were included in cereal boxes. Millions of Americans installed AOL because it was easy, it was present, and it was the only on-ramp to the internet they had ever been handed. By 2000, AOL had 26 million paying subscribers at approximately $22 a month. Its stock, riding the internet boom, was valued at $166 billion. Time Warner, by comparison, was a company with actual tangible assets. HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers Entertainment, Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, a massive cable television infrastructure, Warner Music Group, revenues of $27 billion per year from businesses that had existed for decades, and AOL was acquiring them. The logic Steve Case articulated was the logic of convergence. AOL had the internet distribution, Time Warner had the content. Put them together, and you had the dominant media company of the 21st century. Gerald Levin, Time Warner's CEO, believed it. Not entirely because of the logic, though he found it persuasive. He believed it because he wanted to believe it. He was 60 years old. He wanted to build something that would define his legacy. There is something else you need to know about Gerald Levin. In 1997, his son Jonathan was murdered. Jonathan Levin was a 31-year-old English teacher in the Bronx, killed by a former student who believed he had money. Gerald Levin never fully recovered. Multiple people who knew him afterward described him as a changed person, less focused on tactical business details, more consumed with the idea of doing something that would matter beyond quarterly earnings. He signed the deal. The terms were almost incomprehensibly favorable to AOL. Time Warner shareholders received AOL stock, a currency whose value rested almost entirely on the assumption that AOL's dial-up subscribers would keep growing in a world moving toward broadband. Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, Time Warner's largest individual shareholder, later said the AOL deal cost him approximately $8 billion in personal net worth. He called it the worst business decision of his life. The bubble burst in March 2000, 8 weeks after the deal was announced. Between January and December of 2000, the Nasdaq fell 60%. Technology stocks began to be valued on actual revenue and profit rather than expectations of infinite growth. AOL stock went with them. The currency with which AOL had acquired Time Warner lost more than half its value in the year the deal closed. What followed was worse than a failed merger. It was a documented organizational catastrophe. The cultures were incompatible in ways no integration plan had accounted for. AOL was aggressive, informal, sales-driven, accustomed to moving fast. Time Warner was deliberate, hierarchical, relationship-oriented, accustomed to decades-long business cycles. AOL executives arrived in Time Warner offices with the attitude of conquerors. Time Warner executives responded with the attitude of people who had been occupied. Bob Pittman, the AOL executive installed as co-COO, attempted to force cross-promotion deals between divisions. Time Warner executives quietly resisted. Meetings were scheduled that executives didn't attend. Data that was requested wasn't provided. The synergies that had been promised never materialized. In 2002, AOL Time Warner announced the largest write-down in American corporate history to that point, $99 billion removed from the company's stated value in a single year. The company had destroyed, in approximately 24 months, more value than most nations produce in their entire annual economies. Steve Case resigned from the board in 2003. Gerald Levin had resigned as CEO in 2002. He later said the merger was the single biggest mistake of his professional life. He retired to Venice Beach, California, opened a small wellness retreat, and largely withdrew from the business world. In 2009, Time Warner spun off AOL. The business that had purchased Time Warner for $165 billion was, 9 years later, valued at approximately $3 billion. In 2015, Verizon bought AOL for $4.4 billion, $165 billion to $4.4 billion, in 15 years. In June 2012, 3 engineers, Dom Hoffman, Rus Yusupov, and Colin Kroll, were working on a prototype in a small office in New York City. The idea was almost absurdly simple. A camera app that recorded video only while you pressed and held your thumb on the screen. When you lifted your thumb, recording stopped. The app looped whatever you had captured automatically. 6 seconds maximum. 1 tap to record. Automatic loop. Hoffman later described the insight behind it. He wasn't trying to build a video platform. He was thinking about the GIF, the looping animated image format that had existed since the 1980s. He wanted to build a video GIF, something that captured a moment the way a GIF did, but with real video and real sound. In October 2012, Twitter acquired the app before it had launched publicly. Twitter paid $30 million. The app launched on iOS in January 2013. Within 3 months, it was the most downloaded free application in the Apple App Store. What happened over the next 2 years was something nobody had fully designed and nobody completely understood while it was happening. Vine didn't just become popular, it became a creative medium with its own aesthetic, its own grammar, its own community of practitioners. The 6-second constraint, which looked like a limitation, was actually what made Vine extraordinary. Creators had exactly 6 seconds to make you feel something. That constraint forced a compression of technique that produced entirely new kinds of comedy, storytelling, and visual art. Creators discovered that the loop was the canvas. A joke that set up in the first 3 seconds and paid off in the last 3 hit differently when it played again immediately. Because now you were watching the setup knowing the punchline, and the setup became funnier. Creators started building vines specifically designed to be more rewarding on the third and fourth loop than the first. King Bach built 17 million followers on the platform, which translated directly into film and television roles. Zach King developed editing-based magic tricks that made him internationally famous before he had a single traditional media credit. And a 16-year-old in Pickering, Ontario started posting himself playing guitar covers of popular songs. Shawn Mendes built 6 million followers on Vine. He parlayed that audience into a record deal, a global touring career, and multiple #1 albums. He has said in interviews that Vine was the direct reason his music career exists. Vine was not just an app. It was a talent discovery machine, a cultural generator, and a community with genuine artistic standards. And Twitter owned all of it. Here's where it goes wrong. And it goes wrong not with a dramatic decision, but with a sustained pattern of neglect. Twitter in the 2013 to 2016 period was in continuous internal crisis. The company had gone public in November 2013, and the pressure of slowing user growth immediately dominated the organization's attention. Jack Dorsey had left as CEO, been replaced by Ev Williams, replaced by Dick Costolo, replaced by Jack Dorsey again in 2015. During that period, Twitter went through multiple complete strategic reorientations. Was it a media company, a messaging company, a social network, a news platform? Nobody inside Twitter seemed to agree. Vine sat inside this company trying to get resources. The most fundamental problem was money. Vine's creators, the people whose creativity had built the platform, had no way to earn money through Vine itself. There was no advertising revenue sharing. There was no paid promotion system. There was no creator fund. A Vine creator with 10 million followers, watching their videos get watched hundreds of millions of times, earned exactly nothing from the platform directly. YouTube had been sharing advertising revenue with creators since 2007. Instagram was creating business opportunities for creators. The broader creator economy was beginning to emerge, and Vine was not participating in it. In the summer of 2016, a meeting occurred that has since been described in detail by multiple participants. A group of Vine's top creators, reportedly around 18 of them, representing collectively hundreds of millions of followers, met with Twitter's senior leadership. They presented a specific list of requests. They asked for revenue sharing. They asked for the ability to embed ads in their content. They asked for technical improvements. They asked for a dedicated support team. Their negotiating position was explicit. If these changes weren't made, they would leave. Twitter's response was no. On October 27, 2016, Twitter announced that Vine would be shut down. The announcement came on the same day that Twitter laid off 9% of its global workforce. The creator community organized an attempt to purchase Vine outright from Twitter. Multiple acquisition offers were reportedly made. Twitter declined all of them. Vine went dark in January 2017. In September 2017, a company called ByteDance launched TikTok internationally. Its core product, short vertical video, creator-driven discovery algorithm, looping format, was functionally identical to what Vine had been. TikTok hit 1 billion monthly active users in September 2021, less than 4 years from international launch. TikTok's estimated valuation is between $200 and $300 billion. Twitter, now called X, has spent years trying to build short video products. None has achieved meaningful scale. The company that owned the original format, the original community, and the original technology gave all of it away for nothing. I want to start this last story with a specific moment. It's 1979. Masaru Ibuka, the co-founder of Sony, has a problem. He travels frequently between Tokyo and his vacation home, and the flights are long. He loves classical music. He wants to listen to opera while he travels. He asks Sony's audio division to build him something, a personal cassette player, small enough to hold in one hand, light enough to carry, with headphones. The audio engineers build it in weeks. They remove the recording capability because Ibuka just wants to listen. When Akio Morita, Sony's co-founder, sees the prototype, he understands immediately that Ibuka has identified something real. He takes it to Sony's marketing department. Marketing says no. Their research shows consumers won't buy a device that can only play and can't record. It goes against conventional wisdom about what people want from audio equipment. Morita listens to the objection. He considers it, and then he overrules the marketing department and orders the product into production anyway. The Walkman launched in Japan in July 1979. In its first 2 months, Sony sold 50,000 units. Within 3 years, 15 million. By 1992, the cumulative total was 150 million. The Walkman changed the relationship between music and movement. Before it existed, music was an experience that happened in a fixed location. A concert, a room with a stereo, a car. After the Walkman, music could go anywhere. You could soundtrack your own life. Sony invented portable music. What happened over the following 20 years is one of the most exhaustively documented cases of organizational self-sabotage in business history. By the late 1990s, a file format called MP3 was spreading across the early internet. Fraunhofer Institute in Germany had developed the codec, and by the mid-1990s it was widely available. MP3 files were transformative. A standard CD audio file was approximately 10 megabytes per minute. An MP3 file, compressed, was about 1 megabyte per minute with audio quality close enough to CD to satisfy most listeners. Thousands of songs could fit on a hard drive. Sony's engineers understood what MP3 meant. They were some of the best audio engineers in the world. They had the technical capability to build devices that played MP3 files. They had the brand, they had the supply chain, and they had a record label. Sony Music was, and remains, one of the largest music labels in the world. In 1999, it represented artists including Michael Jackson, Celine Dion, Mariah Carey, Bruce Springsteen, and hundreds of others. It generated billions of dollars annually from the sale of physical media. Sony Music looked at the MP3 format and saw one thing above everything else: piracy. MP3 files could be copied infinitely without quality loss. They could be shared over the internet. Napster, which launched in 1999, was built specifically to distribute MP3 files. To Sony Music's leadership, MP3 was not a technology. It was an existential threat. So Sony, as a corporation, made a choice. Its consumer electronics division would not build devices that supported MP3. Instead, Sony created its own proprietary digital audio format, A-Track, Adaptive Transform Acoustic Coding. A-Track files were encrypted. They could only be created and played on Sony-licensed software and hardware. They were not interoperable with anything else. If you bought a Sony digital music player, which, given that Sony had invented the Walkman category, many people did, you could not simply transfer your MP3 collection to it. You had to open a piece of software called Sonic Stage, which would convert your MP3 files to A-Track format, locking them to Sony's ecosystem. The conversion was slow. The software was poorly designed. Transfers often failed. This decision was made at the corporate level, overriding the objections of engineers in Sony's consumer electronics division, who understood that consumers would not accept this friction. The music label's interests took priority over the product division's judgment. On October 23, 2001, Steve Jobs held up a white rectangle about the size of a deck of cards. 1,000 songs in your pocket. The iPod supported MP3. It worked with music you already owned. Music ripped from CDs, music purchased anywhere. You transferred it through iTunes, which was simple enough that anyone could figure it out without instructions. Sony's response, in 2004, was the Network Walkman. It did not support MP3 natively. It required Sonic Stage. It converted your MP3 files to A-Track before putting them on the device. The battery life was better than the iPod's. The audio quality was arguably superior. The physical design was compact and attractive, and it required you to use Sonic Stage. Consumer Reports documented that users were spending hours simply trying to get music onto the device. Files would disappear. Transfers would hang. The software would crash. People gave up and bought an iPod. In April 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store, 99 cents per song, legal, instant, simple. In its first week, 1 million songs sold. In its first year, 70 million. Sony launched Connect, its competing music store, in 2004. Connect sold music in 8-track format exclusively. It had a fraction of iTunes' catalog. Its interface was confusing. It closed in 2008. In 2007, 6 years after the iPod launched, Sony released a Walkman that could natively play MP3 files. By then, the iPod had 73% of the US portable music player market. Sony's share was in the low single digits. The company that had invented the Walkman, that had created the entire category of personal portable audio, had spent 6 years losing a war to a computer company that had never made a music player before. Not because Sony lacked the technology. Their audio engineering was world-class. Not because Sony lacked the brand. The Walkman was one of the most recognized consumer product names on Earth. They lost because one division of the company, the music label, had enough internal political power to override the product judgment of another division. One arm of Sony fought the other arm of Sony, and the consumer went somewhere else while they were fighting. The irony, complete in a way that feels almost designed. Sony Music is today one of the most valuable music companies in the world. It makes more money from Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube streaming royalties than it ever made from physical media. The format that Sony fought for 6 years didn't destroy Sony Music. It made Sony Music more valuable. Sony fought the future of music distribution to protect a business that the future ultimately made larger. 6 stories, 6 industries, 6 completely different decades. And if you look at them together, really look at them as a group, the same mechanism is operating in every single one. Blockbuster didn't lose to streaming. Streaming didn't exist at the critical moment. Blockbuster lost because an activist investor, measuring performance by a metric that protected existing revenue, removed the CEO who was building the future. The decision to bring back the late fee was not made by an idiot. It was made by someone optimizing for the wrong outcome. BlackBerry didn't lose to the touchscreen. It lost because the co-founders who built the company had such deep personal and professional investment in the existing paradigm that they couldn't evaluate the iPhone on its own terms. They could only see it through the lens of what they had already decided a smartphone should be. Netscape didn't lose to a better product. For years, Netscape's browser was technically superior to Internet Explorer. Netscape lost because a larger company used its monopoly position to make competition economically impossible, and the legal remedies arrived too late to help. AOL didn't lose to the market. AOL's business was already dying. Dial-up internet subscriptions were being abandoned for broadband at a rate that would have been fatal regardless. But the Time Warner deal destroyed value in both directions at once. It didn't just fail. It annihilated the real assets of Time Warner while accelerating AOL's decline. Vine didn't lose to TikTok. TikTok didn't exist when Twitter killed Vine. Vine lost because Twitter couldn't focus on any single product long enough to develop it, and because the people inside Twitter made a specific, documented decision not to share revenue with the creators whose creativity had built the audience. And Sony didn't lose to Apple. Sony had better audio technology than Apple. Sony had more brand equity in portable music than any company on Earth. Sony lost because one division of the company had enough internal political power to override the product judgment of another division, and the consumer went somewhere else while they were fighting. Here's the pattern. A company succeeds. Success creates organizational complexity. More employees, more divisions, more processes, more stakeholders. Complexity creates people whose job it is to protect the existing operation. The people whose job it is to protect the existing operation become, over time, the most powerful people in the organization. Not because they're malicious, because they control the revenue. And the revenue is what the organization exists to protect. When the future arrives, it arrives as a threat to the people who protect the revenue. So the people who protect the revenue do what they are structurally designed to do. They protect the revenue, the future gets postponed, then it gets managed, then it gets suppressed, and then it arrives without them. I've thought a lot about whether there's something individuals inside these organizations could have done differently. And I think the honest answer is sometimes yes, often no. There were people inside Blockbuster who understood exactly what Netflix was doing and what it meant. There were engineers inside BlackBerry who watched the iPhone announcement and understood immediately that everything was about to change. There were people inside Sony's consumer electronics division who knew that refusing to support MP3 was commercial suicide. They wrote memos, they raised concerns, they pushed back in meetings, and then they were overruled by people who had spent their careers optimizing for a world that was ending. The lesson is not that these companies were stupid. The lesson is that success is its own trap. The more successful an organization becomes, the more sophisticated its mechanisms for protecting that success become. And those mechanisms are exactly the thing that prevents it from responding to whatever comes next. The companies that are still here, the ones that faced disruption and survived, didn't survive by managing the transition more carefully. They survived by being willing, at the critical moment, to make a decision that looked insane from the perspective of the current business. Reed Hastings was willing to bet on streaming when streaming didn't work yet. Steve Jobs was willing to destroy the iPod with the iPhone when the iPod was still growing. Amazon was willing to build AWS even though it had nothing to do with selling books. They chose the future over the present. Not once, not in a single heroic moment. Over and over, in room after room, in a series of decisions that each looked individually unremarkable and collectively amounted to survival. These companies had everything. What the surviving companies had was the willingness to decide what they were, instead of letting what they had already built make that decision for them. That's the difference. And it is, when you sit with it, one of the hardest things that any organization or any person can do.